is rooting much of what he sees in the Old Testament and bringing it to its final consummation. Number 6, we must be careful not to make Revelation a detailed chronology of the future. John's larger concern is that despite present appearances, God is in control of history. God will bring about the final destruction of evil, and he will bring about the final introduction of Jesus' kingdom that will reign forever. So Revelation is not necessarily in chronological order. Rather, John is showing the final pictures of what's going to happen in history as God ushers in the conclusion of this age. Point number 7. We need to understand the historical setting of Revelation when the church was going through a great time of suffering and persecution. A good Bible dictionary will help you understand this historical background. As I discussed earlier, it was written in about 96 AD under an emperor who was certainly persecuting the Christians heavily. Number 8, we need to understand the difference between tribulation and wrath. Some Christians read through other New Testament books and they find things like 1 Thessalonians 5:9 that says, God did not appoint us to suffer wrath, but to receive salvation. And they say, see that? No wrath. So Christians cannot possibly go through anything John talks about in Revelation. Therefore, we must all be raptured before any tribulation. And they say there is pre-tribulation rapture. And yet we know, by just looking into history when John writes it, that Christians were certainly under tribulation at the time. So there is a difference between tribulation, which is what the church is enduring and will endure, and then wrath, which is God's judgment on those who afflict God's people. These two distinctions are very important when you read the book of Revelation, and they'll also help you better understand and make your end-time doctrines. And number 9, we need to see the overall structure of the book of Revelation. Our book helps us understand how to read the Bible for all it's worth, helps us to understand that there are 3 sets of 7 throughout Revelation. It talks about the first 7 with the seals, then the second set of 7 with the trumpets, the third set of 7 with the plagues. These shouldn't be looked at as separate events, but rather different aspects of the same events. 3 sets of 7 dealing with the same visions and issues of the final consummation, destruction of evil, and bringing in of righteousness. So with these basic exegetical principles in place, we need to ask ourselves, what can we pull into our time, and what can we apply from Revelation to ourselves? In other words, what are good hermeneutical principles for Revelation? Well, number 1, it's the same as it was with the epistles. What is historical only, and what is for today? When Jesus says things like, those whom I love, I rebuke and discipline, so be earnest and repent. When he says that in Revelation 3:19, I think our enlightened common sense kicks in and says, yes, that's for me, just as much as it's for that first century church that John was actually writing to under the inspiration of Jesus Christ. So we can pull those things easily into the future. However, and this comes into number 2, we have to discern between the now and not yet dimensions of the prophecies. As John writes, just like Old Testament prophets, much of what he talked about certainly had some fulfillment in the near future. When John talks about those locusts with scorpion tails and human faces and women's hair, and his New Testament readers see that as the barbarian horde, well, the Roman government did actually face some of its temporal downfall through that horde. So there's definitely the immediate fulfillment of that prophecy, and yet we know that Revelation has not completed. We are not at new heavens and new earth, and so there's that tension between the immediate fulfillment and the not yet fulfillment of those prophecies. And then number 3, we must be careful not to spend too much time trying to make the details of Revelation fit into our current geopolitical worldview. Like, who is 666? In the West, many people, to their own detriment, have tried to assign this number to figure out who the Antichrist is to prominent world leaders. Many of our U.S. presidents have been said to fit the mark of the beast, and that the number of their name fits 666, so they are the Antichrist. Popes in the past have been said to fit that number, and so they must be the Antichrist. Today, what's big is to say that Islam is the Antichrist, that Turkey is Babylon. So we need to be careful about all of these things because really we're just guessing. These are not good hermeneutical considerations. Pulling it into our 21st century mindset is not what John intended. So we need to be careful about that. Another thing that I've heard that, again, it just comes down to, you have no idea whether or not it's true, is when it talks about in Revelation 9 that 200 million man army, and on their breastplate is red, blue, and yellow. So Christians have taken that to say, well, that's the colors and flag of their nation. So what modern nations have red, blue, and yellow in their flags? And one of those must be that army. Well, we just simply cannot do that. We don't know that those colors on their breastplates are intended to be the flag colors of a nation. Those are poor hermeneutics. Well, I hope that's been helpful in better understanding Revelation, this unique book. We apply the same exegetical principles that we've applied to the epistles and the parables, and we give the same hermeneutical considerations when we think about what's only for history and what's for today. Now that we've concluded our different types of genre, let's look at some points of summation for each of them. The first one we looked at were the Old Testament narratives. These are historical, not moral teachings, and they're used to progress God's story. The second one that we looked at is Old Testament law. These were specific to Israel as God's covenant with them as a nation. These are not our laws. Thirdly, we looked at the Psalms. These are Israel's prayers and our prayers. It's a guide for pouring our praises and prayers to God. Number 4, we looked at the Old Testament wisdom books. These are general truths in poetic style, and they need to be viewed against explicit doctrine in the Bible. Number 5, Old Testament prophets. These were enforcers of Old Testament law, and we need to understand their writing in the time of history for the book. Number 6, we looked at the Gospels. These were 4 perspectives containing Jesus' sayings and doings. Number 7 were the parables within the Gospels. We need to remember not to allegorize them, but understand what the main point was that Jesus was illustrating. What would the readers have taken away immediately upon hearing the parable? Number 8, we looked at the book of Acts, as it traces a selective history of the expansion of the gospel. It doesn't show us what an ideal church looks like, and it doesn't give us a comprehensive history of the New Testament church. Number 9, we looked at the epistles. They are our major source of Christian doctrine, and yet there's still occasional documents. You can't look at any one epistle and expect to understand systematic theology on any topic of doctrine. And lastly, we just looked at Revelation, which mirrors much of the prophets in the Old Testament, and is completely unique as it deals with end times and an apocalyptic genre. Anyone who tries to exegete and pull hermeneutics out of Revelation should do so humbly and openly with a group of Christians. So that concludes our Class 8, and I hope you've enjoyed looking at the various types of genre and our principles for interpreting them.